February 21st, 1977. At approximately 9 p.m. on a cold winter night, Chicago firefighters responded to a call.
Remmy Chow was a native of the Philippines, living in Chicago, Illinois, with her husband Jose, who went by the name of Joe. Both Remmy and Joe were respected members of the community, with Joe being a surgeon at the Edgewater Hospital and Remmy working by his side as a respiratory therapist. This was 1977, and life was good for the Chows, but little did they know, everything was about to change. It were a typical summer's day in Chicago when Remmy, feeling a little worn out, mentioned to Joe that she was going to try and get some rest between shifts. This was the middle of the day, but Joe wasn't concerned. They both worked hard. Shifts could be long and strenuous, so Remmy taking an afternoon nap on the couch wasn't out of the ordinary. And as Remmy slept, Joe pottered about the house. Joe loved to keep a tidy home, and as he walked through the kitchen, he would take in the little details of each room. But very quickly, the mood changed. Remmy was laying on the sofa, on her back, with her feet facing Joe, when suddenly she jolted upright, sitting on the sofa, but her back now straight and her eyes staring into Joe's. Joe, obviously taken aback, took a second just looking in his wife's eyes. Now, it's important to know that the town in the Philippines where Remmy was born, the residents spoke their native language of Tagalog. Both Remmy and Joe were familiar with the language, but they'd not used it for a long time. Yet now, in a thick accent that Joe didn't recognise, and speaking fully in a native tongue, she opened her mouth and uttered the words, "Doctor, I'd like to ask for your help." Joe just looked on in disbelief. His wife, waking from her sleep and now talking in a language they both hadn't used in years, in an accent he didn't recognise, left him feeling more confused than anything else. But again, before Joe had a chance to open his mouth, Remmy would continue. "The man who murdered me is still at large." But to understand this in context, we need to go back around a year.
Are you fed up with cable TV promises?
Well, #1 in custom-built garages, and
some people are saying most new jobs will soon be computer-related.
48-year-old Teresita Basa also worked at Edgewater Hospital, doing the same respiratory therapist job, and been born in the Philippines, just like Remmy. This naturally made the two women close friends. Moving to Chicago back in the 1960s, Teresita had dreams of becoming a musician. But, although spending a good majority of her 30s studying music, she finally ended up in healthcare, which she found she had a real fondness for. Teresita was just a general, all-round good spirit. She easily made friends with the people she met and was full of life, and it would come as no surprise that when one of her colleagues at the hospital had been talking about how he was a little down on his luck, Teresita would constantly try to lift his mood. But behind closed doors, things were not as they seemed. Teresita had an on-off relationship with her boyfriend, and neighbours of the 15th floor apartment where Teresita lived would often report loud banging and shouting into the night. They were often spotted arguing out in public, which was so out of character for Teresita, leaving people to suspect her boyfriend was probably the reason behind these disruptions. Many times when Teresita and her boyfriend would be arguing, the neighbours would sit peering through the window, watching as the drama unfolded. So when Teresita offered her colleague an opportunity to earn a few extra bucks, invited him over to her apartment to fix a TV, her neighbours were on the lookout. They watched as Teresita and some man who was clearly not her boyfriend walked inside her apartment. Inside the apartment, Teresita explained the issue with the TV, which her colleague took a look at and realised he didn't have the right tools to fix the job. His apartment wasn't that far away, so he explained to Teresita that he would call back home, grab the right tools for the job, check in on his girlfriend, and if all was okay, he would return to fix the TV at a later date. but a colleague never did return, and just a while later, the same neighbours who watched as Teresita entered her apartment with a random guy were now frantically calling the authorities. Both police and fire departments were called out to Teresita's apartment, and upon entering through the door they were faced with a mattress on the floor, fully engulfed in flames. As the fire was put out and the mattress turned over, police would find a fully naked Teresita with a deep stab wound in her chest. Teresita had been murdered. There wasn't much for police to go on. Whoever had committed this crime had done so knowing the fire would cover their tracks. But they had to have been watching Teresita, aware of her entering the apartment with a colleague, knowing when they left. But the only lead that police would have would be a small entry in Teresita's diary, simply stating, "Get tickets for AS." Police interviewed everyone who knew Teresita, including a boyfriend, who all had solid alibis, so the case ran dry. A whole 6 months later, and Joe was now standing in his kitchen, staring into his wife's eyes while she spoke in a language he's not heard in a long time, with an accent he wasn't familiar with. Little did Joe know at the time that both these events would change their lives forever, and provide some of the most concrete evidence of the paranormal that had ever been reported in their local community. If this is the first time you've watched any of my content, then you may be surprised to know that although I share stories of a disturbing and sometimes paranormal nature, I'm actually quite skeptical. I'm a true believer that the truth can be way scarier than fiction, but in creating these stories, I get to spend a little time investigating the small details of each case. What I found is that when you dig a little deeper into each report, you start seeing hidden details that are not always spoken about, as they don't fit the narrative of the story. So, if like me, you like to know the full story, the details that most people don't share and the information that's kept secret as it explains the same version of events in a more logical way, then you need to check out my Patreon. Members receive an early preview of each video, but I also provide exclusive content that dives a little deeper into each case, sharing the truth behind the claims and giving a different perspective on what truly happened. What's more, by supporting me on Patreon, you get to suggest stories, take part in sections of each video, and much more. Links are in the description if you want to check it out, and if not, that's no problem. You can still show your support for the channel by hitting the like button or clicking subscribe. Thank you, and now, back to the video. After Remmy had snapped out of her trance-like state, she saw her husband looking clearly confused and in shock, standing at the foot of the sofa. Remmy had no recollection of speaking with her husband, nor did she know anything that she'd said. But as Joe sat and explained what had just happened, Remmy started to remember a dream she'd been having. In this dream, a figure that she couldn't quite make out had come asking her for help. It was fuzzy, and she couldn't fully remember what had happened, but she was sure these two events were linked. After this had happened, and a few weeks had gone by, both Remmy and Joe had pushed it to the back of their mind. They would both think about it, but they would never really discuss it again. That was, until 5 weeks later, when it happened again. It started out as a normal night, with Remmy and Joe washing up and making their way to bed. Remmy had fallen asleep before Joe, and Joe was just laying in bed, eyes closed but still awake. Out of nowhere, just like before, Remmy jolted upright and turned to face Joe, staring into his eyes. But this time Joe was prepared. You see, although neither Remmy nor Joe had really spoken about what had happened on that first day, Joe had been thinking about it a lot. He regretted not trying to communicate in some way with this spirit that he believed had possessed his wife. So as soon as Remmy jolted upright in bed, Joe was immediately alert. He looked at his wife, who was just staring back at him, and without hesitation, he asked, "Who are you?" Remmy, once again in a native language with the same thick accent, answered, "My name is Teresita Basa." On hearing this, Joe fell back into his pillow. Teresita worked with both Joe and Remmy. She was a close friend of his wife. He knew all of the murder case, so as you can imagine, he's now petrified, just staring back at this voice that's coming from his wife. Now remember, Joe and Remmy were respected members of the community, both a surgeon and a respiratory therapist, which are both very stressful and hard-working jobs. Joe didn't want to be going around announcing that the ghost of his fellow colleague was now possessing his wife. Not only would this put his reputation at risk, but it may even cause him his job. But when just a week later, the spirit of Teresita would once again take over his wife's body as she was sleeping, Joe knew what he had to do. So when he heard that his wife had started heavy breathing, a sign Joe knew that Remmy was asleep, Joe just sat there, fully alert, waiting, ready for Teresita to return. And sure enough, around an hour later, Remmy once again jolted upright and turned to Joe. Without hesitation, Joe asked the spirit, "What do you want from us?" Remmy just sat motionless, staring into Joe's eyes. Joe looked down at her mouth as she uttered the words, "You have nothing to be afraid of, but I need your help. You need to help me catch the man that did this to me." Joe took a second and replied, "How do I do this? Who killed you?" To which Teresita replied, "He has my jewelry." Joe was still confused. He had no idea what any of this meant. He knew that these possessions only lasted a matter of minutes, so the only thing he could think of was to ask, "Who did this to you?" To which Teresita replied, "Alan Showery." With that, Remmy took a deep breath, like she'd been gasping for air the whole time and could finally breathe again. She looked over at Joe, who now looked more angry than before. Remmy asked, "What's wrong, Joe? What happened?" And Joe told her, "I know who killed Teresita Basa." After this final encounter with Teresita, Joe knew he had to do something about it. He knew that putting his reputation on the line like this wouldn't be easy, but he had no choice. The lead investigator for the case were two detectives called Joseph Stachula and Lee Eplin. Joe reached out to Detective Stachula, who surprisingly took the claim seriously. Detective Stachula had worked many cases, but he was used to working the streets, where the main witnesses were also criminals, drug addicts and working girls. So when Joe first contacted him, the detective looked at him as a credible witness. Joe was a doctor, his wife a respiratory therapist. They lived in an expensive house in a nice, expensive neighbourhood. The only lead they had on the case was the diary entry that Teresita had written before her murder, stating that she needed to collect tickets for AS. Joe is now providing a potential suspect in Alan Showery, a man known to the police, a man who worked with Teresita and would potentially have known her. This was more than a hunch to Detective Stachula. Alan Showery was a hard-working guy, living with his girlfriend in a pretty run-down area of town. He didn't make friends easily, and he'd been in trouble with the law since he was young. And on this cold February morning in 1977, Alan had woke up before his girlfriend, got dressed, made his way to work as a technician at Edgewater Hospital. Whilst there, he struck up a conversation with a friend who would ask him how he was doing, and he'd mentioned that money was really tight at the minute, and he was worried about making rent at the end of the month. His friend told him to keep his spirits up as she was sure his luck would soon change, and, to help him on his way, she had a broken TV that she would be happy for him to come fix, and she'd pay him a little money for it too. Alan jumped at this opportunity and said, "Of course, how about we go after work?" This same friend had already booked tickets for a local theatre production that she planned on gifting to Alan, giving him one night, just him and his girlfriend, away from the stresses of life and without the financial burden. This friend was Teresita Basa. But on the day when Teresita returned home with a work colleague who was there to fix a broken TV, that work colleague was the very same Alan Showery. Now, we don't know what happened in that apartment when the door was closed, but from what we can piece together, Alan had attacked Teresita, stabbing her in the chest. He'd then taken her jewellery, stripped her naked, placed a mattress on top of her body, and set fire to it. He then left the building, returned home to his girlfriend and told her that he didn't have the right tools for the job and that he would go back tomorrow to finish off. What's more, he then gifted his girlfriend a pearl ring and a jade pendant that he'd stolen from Teresita's apartment, which he explained was a late Christmas present. Ultimately, it was this jewellery that led to Alan being arrested when Detective Stachula visited his apartment and found his now pregnant girlfriend wearing the items. But when taken down to the police station, he would sign a full confession. He admitted to visiting Basa at her home, attacking her, stealing her jewellery and lighting the fire. He ultimately faced 14 years in prison for the crimes of murder, theft and arson. But this case doesn't end there. Changed statements, forced confessions, secrets and lies, and a suspicious detail that may reveal that the real killer was actually the one who was claiming they were possessed. And if you want to know the full story behind the story, then please feel free to check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description. So what do you think? Was this the work of a supernatural? Or maybe a cover-up to something even more sinister? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this video or you enjoy strange but true cases, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You can also check out our shorter form content on both Shorts and TikTok. Links are found below. And with that, I'll see you next time.